folks at ATSC for inviting me back. So just want to tell you a little bit about what I'll be speaking about. And if people can't hear me, I'll speak up. If not, I'll continue apace. So first of all, this is about 3 different presentations rolled into one and stuffed into 45 minutes. So there's a lot of stuff in there that I've tried to abridge, but if there are questions, what I believe we're going to do is try to hold them, because Julia Hughes will be speaking after me from the US, and so we'll try to take the questions together. Afterwards, I'll be more than happy to speak to individual people. What I'm trying to do is, like I said, stuff a whole lot of stuff, some of which is totally conjecture. We don't know where some things are going, and certain presidents in certain countries are not making that job easy for us. So what I'll do is I'll start rolling through, try to keep it as light as possible, because it's not inherently the most interesting subject in the world, and see where it takes us. If you have some questions about just what do you mean, put your hand up. I'll see if I can adjust where I'm going, because again, I'm squeezing things in here for sure. Just in terms of who we are, the Canadian Apparel Federation is a national industry group based in Ottawa. Our bread and butter is things like trade policy, regulatory issues, things like textile labeling, the infamous upholstered and stuffed articles label in Ontario. So we do that kind of gritty work that no one else wants to do, sort of 24/7. If you look there as well, obviously information and advocacy go together. We are lobbyists. We try to change these things to make them better. In terms of information, we have a newsletter that goes out to about 6,000 people in Canada, website apparel.ca, and increasingly we try to move some of our comment groups onto Facebook, because it's much simpler for people to talk to each other than to talk to me. So there's one on NAFTA, there's another one on Canadian sourcing, both of which have gotten a good response so far this summer, and we're trying to build them up. So again, look for us on Facebook at Canadian Apparel Federation. The last section is sort of the growth for us, and I think the area of concern for a lot of people, that there just aren't the people available to work in the industry that we need, whether it's that white collar or blue collar. Every second conversation, even here, is about it's amazing how many people want us to do more work here in Canada. So training, we have a large wage subsidy program with about $800,000 in Ontario, and we have a career fair actually next month here in Toronto. So take a look at that if you want, or speak to me afterwards. I have some little literature on it, but don't want to go into too much detail. So the agenda is pretty straightforward, kind of go through a whole range of different subjects, not bear down, not too much heavy information, but I hope to give you some insights. A lot of it is naturally a comparison between us and the United States. Julia Hughes will do a much better job of speaking about the United States than I could. But, you know, there's a totally different attitude regarding trade, at least at the political level. And it certainly has a certain resonance through the population. Canada's the attitudes toward NAFTA have never been stronger in support of NAFTA than they are right now. Never. NAFTA was a tenuous issue when it was actually adopted. Free trade before that, well, the Liberals lost the election to Brown Mulroney because they supported standing down for free trade. So we have never had a more universal support for free trade in Canada. Separately, Canadians support multilateralism, that we should have organizations like the G7, United Nations, World Trade Organization handle our business. Now, I don't think we do this for altruism's sake. We're a small player in the world relatively, or mid-sized player, and multilateral institutions help us. So we want a rules-based trading system, point final. We don't want to muck around with it every second minute whenever we decide to tweet. There you go. It's not going to say. So I usually put the slide up in some fashion or another. You can choose the year, any year between 2000 and 2005 on this side, any year after 2010. I just did a presentation in 2013. I used that, and I've decided never to change that slide. So I think what we used to always concern ourselves with about import, we had quotas, we had all these protections, we had tariffs, we had all these kinds of things, and they really didn't work. They set the system up, they structured the trade, but they didn't really work. So now we generally have lower tariffs, more openness, okay? We care more about competitiveness and innovation as opposed to protection. And where we used to say just made in Canada, and there's nothing wrong with made in Canada, don't get me wrong, but most companies are making stuff in the world. So if I use the expression made in the world, does anyone know what I'm actually referring to? There's a product that is synonymous with this expression. You can't answer that, Julia. It's the iPhone. The iPhone says made in China. It also says, designed in California or whatever. But if you took the value of the iPhone, you would find that about 50-55% are components sourced all over Southeast Asia. 35%, give or take, is from California. So taken together, 85-90% of the value of the iPhone is not from China. But it says made in China, right? Because that's where it's made. So the fact is that we're buying goods all over the world, made from India, China, Pakistan. I can just look at the flags across the horizon here. But it's really made in the world. We do stuff here, we do stuff there, we use fabric from somewhere else, and we pull it together. And frankly, there is no constraint in Canada except we don't have enough employees to grow what we do here. It's not a factor of tariffs and quotas. It's, can we train enough people? Do we have enough white-collar people? And do we have some support from the government? So that, to my mind, distinguishes us from the past. I'm going to skip ahead because I'll sit here for 10 minutes explaining all these terms and try to do it as I go. Just want to paint a few pictures here about the general gist of things. Start out with exports. And in general, as we see, I'll talk about NAFTA. The reason we talk about NAFTA is because of the exports. Something like 40% of what's made here, maybe to 50%, depending on what number you look at, is sold into the United States. So our domestic manufacturing of goods is heavily tied to NAFTA. The second number is another good number because Netherlands, we don't actually sell anything to anyone in the Netherlands. Netherlands is just a transit point into Europe. So, for example, when one outerwear company in Canada switched its entry point into Europe from Germany to Netherlands, so the sales to Netherlands went up by 3 times, but it had nothing to do with nothing. It was just that they chose to land their goods in the Netherlands. When you take Europe together, it's not a bad figure, and I'll get into some of the numbers a little bit later. So basically, NAFTA for us is an export destination, by far the largest one, and never to be replaced by Europe unless, I can't even imagine the circumstance, but Europe is growing. And again, imports, most of the numbers are more or less familiar to people. I ended it at 2006, I could end it later. I'll bring you up to the most recent stats in the next slide. China is basically stable and declining. Bangladesh, stable and declining a little bit. And then you have 2 growth countries, Cambodia and Vietnam. And we'll get to Vietnam when we talk about TPP. But this is actually year to date. And again, if you look at it, you'll see China, as I said, small decline, Bangladesh, small decline. Again, Vietnam, no trade preference today, but Vietnam's growing like crazy. Cambodia, doing well. So, if you look broadly speaking at what the Canadian trade policy is about these days, you don't see the word protection anywhere, by the way. You see a problem, and that is that we've got all our eggs in one basket in NAFTA, and we need to figure out something to do. We have to rebalance that. That's not in this industry, it's in every industry. There was a cabinet shuffle beginning of August or late July, and the Minister of International Trade, his title was changed to Minister of International Trade Diversification. Pretty straightforward. I mean, we have to figure out different ways, different countries with whom to trade. A couple other things that I'll mention, but not too much, but I would encourage you to keep thinking about it. Responsible business conduct. Current government is very big on issues around ethical sourcing, potentially looking at supply chain transparency, many of the things that are active, say, in Britain. California has some of these provisions, and again, government's moving that way. Now, the last thing is I just wanted to remind people that we have a policy that was instituted in 2010, fully implemented in 2015 for duty-free tariff on textiles, on fabrics. So there aren't too many other developed countries that charge no duties on imported textiles. We have an open trading relationship, and if you can make it here, you're going to be making it with duty-free textiles, and that is quite unique in the developed world for sure. So if we look at the trade agreements, as I said, NAFTA is important, and again, if we weren't renegotiating it, I would say, it's kind of stable. 10 years ago, not 10 years ago, maybe around 2002, which is more than 10 years ago, we were shipping almost $3 billion to the United States in apparel. Now it's substantially less. So again, you can't say that NAFTA is growing, but it's important. So if you look at the other trade agreements, and I'll give another chart next, many of them that follow the NAFTA rules of origin aren't doing anything. So we have the NAFTA rules, which require yarn to be made within the region, the fabric to be made within the region, and the cut and sew in the region. Triple transformation rule of origin, yarn for a rule of origin, whatever you want to call it. So wherever we use that, nothing happens because it's too restrictive. So what we've done, and especially the more recent agreements, we have a free trade agreement with Korea, which is for apparel, simple cut and sew. Cut and sew it in Korea, ship it to Canada duty-free. The same agreement with Jordan. Cut and sew in Jordan, ship it to Canada duty-free. Those are the agreements that have potential to grow. Now, the other, just here, I mentioned before that Bangladesh is fairly the second largest import source, but stable. Cambodia is growing. Both of those countries are least developed countries and qualify for duty-free apparel entry into Canada. So the volume of goods under the LDC exceeds the value of goods substantially that we import through free trade agreements. So again, these are some of the agreements we have. I usually do a quiz before to say, do we have free trade with Iceland? But I didn't want to embarrass anybody. But we do have free trade agreement with Iceland, and that's under the European Free Trade Area. So again, we have free trade agreements with everyone. And we'll go at the end and just talk about what might be coming next. But I'm going to see if I can do this. NAFTA, obviously the most important thing in the world. So we started out talking to the Americans last, after the inauguration, maybe March, April was the first meeting, and we said, or Donald Trump said, we might tweak NAFTA. Well, that's okay, that's all right, tweaking is good. And this cartoon, for those that aren't old and don't remember quotes from the senior Prime Minister Trudeau, there was the analogy of, Canada is the mouse in this picture sleeping next to the elephant. If the elephant rolls over, kills the mouse. So the idea being we're this little character next door, he moves, he kills us. So define tweaked. So of course most people in Canada thought the tweaked had some different meaning, a little more sinister, and in fact I think the whole thing has sort of borne itself out. If you look last year at the, just go back. What did I just do? There we go. Hold on, I'm gonna do this. There you go. Right here, last year at this show, this is when I spoke. So this is a roller coaster of the media coverage of NAFTA over just last year, not into 2018. It's absolutely the best thing in the world. So, okay, so right around 2, that's when Donald Trump is inaugurated. And he says, oh, we'll just tweak NAFTA. Okay, then we go down to April, when he almost signed an executive order withdrawing from NAFTA. Came that close. That's number 3. Okay, so then we go up in the summer, we're not so bad. And then a little bumps, and then, but last year, we were good. Things look good. It's all right. Holy shit, what happened in September? Okay, so that was when the Americans basically said, we're ready to tear it up. We're gonna screw you on this, we're gonna screw you on that, we want changes on dairy, we don't want you to be able to access our government procurement. Julia, did I miss anything? Oh, there's a sunset clause. Unbelievable nonsense. But this is the most accurate thing. Now, Maclean's magazine, which is probably bankrupt anyway, but hasn't updated it this year, it would just continue on, right? Who could sell a magazine in this environment? So that is really what the last 18 months has been, if you're in this job. So I go to places like Memphis, St. Louis, to talk about NAFTA, and I say, here's the good news, look at all the states that have Canada as the main trading partner. However, I never showed this slide until I say, how many people think, Tennessee's which is your largest trading partner? Is it China? Is it this? And they said, no one ever says Canada. I said, and so no one knows it. So that's the good news. There's a big trading relationship. The bad news is we're far more dependent on them than they are on us. And that's just a simple reality. Look at Ontario. How many people pay taxes in Ontario? 49% of our economy is linked to the United States. That's not so good. So when we started the whole NAFTA discussions, the US came in with clear objectives. They wanted to tighten up the rules because they didn't want to have any bleeding of origin to China. Didn't want any kind of inputs from China coming in. Then they have these comments in here. This is their text, not mine. Genuinely made in the United States. Like, what does that mean? Come on now, what does that mean? All sorts of extra origin verification, all sorts of things to make everyone's life just awful. Okay. And this actually I think is a much clearer statement, This is Commerce Secretary of the United States, and he's basically saying, we want everything, we will give you nothing. Okay, there you go. that's it. We will want everything, and we will give you nothing. And it's a remarkably clear statement. Now, the reality is that, and this isn't entirely clear, but the first set of bar charts are about trade between Canada, the US, and textiles. The second one is textile products like tents and anything but clothing, and then apparel. And really what all this shows is that on an annual basis, I think that's 2016, the US has a massive $1.3 billion surplus with Canada in textiles and apparel. So that's good, right? I mean, I think 1.3 billion, that's good. Because, I mean, the administration defined a deficit with a country as a bad thing, which may or may not be the case, but you'd think if they got a surplus, it's got to be a good thing. And again, just to put this in perspective, here is Canada's market share of the United States in apparel. 0.72%. Not 72, 0.72. There's not a problem here, okay? You've got a great surplus with us. We don't ship that much to you. Bob's your own. So, our position, I think the Canadian government's position has been, well, hold on a second. Let's not do any harm. It seems to be working well. And, we can tweak things. But, it should be reasonable. In fact, last June, not this last June, but a year previous, the first hearings on NAFTA renegotiation were held in the US. And I went down as a spectator and wasn't going to heckle anybody. And I was on the phone with the Canadian textile negotiator, our guy that's doing this work on our field. And so I was talking to him, and he says, well, I don't expect much controversy, really. You know, you've got the Americans have a huge surplus with us, 1.3 billion, you know. And I said, yeah, but, you know, I'm not so sure. So I literally go into the hearing room at the U.S. Trade Representatives, USTR or Commerce. Anyway, you know, one of the federal agencies, and of course, U.S. textile industry is appearing and basically says, oh my God, it's a terrible thing. NAFTA's the worst thing in the world. We've got to change everything. We've got to change these loopholes that Canada's exploited, et cetera, et cetera. So just when you think, you know, we're not good, there's no problem here. Why are we bothering? All of a sudden we know why we're bothering, because there's a constituency in the US for really, really tightening the rules so that foreign content just doesn't qualify. So I'll talk about maintaining TPLs. So under NAFTA, there's a specific provision that allows for companies to use imported materials, whether it's fibers, yarns, fabrics, in producing textile or apparel products in Canada. And they're called TPLs, tariff preference levels. And it basically says I can make this suit in Montreal, as this suit is made in Montreal, and I can import the fabric from Italy, and we can still get NAFTA duty rates, which are 0. And it was a central feature of NAFTA. It was a similar feature in the original Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. And it basically allows companies to source their inputs from somewhere else if needed. I don't think anyone in Montreal would source their fabric from India, China, Turkey, wherever, if they could get it competitively in North America. Why would you? And the fact is that this fabric has not been available from textile mills in North America for 20, 30 years. So the TPL is very important. Frequently you'll find that a company is making a product. There's a great example of a glove company within an hour of here that makes a protective glove where 80% of the yarns are sourced from Invista in the US, 20 or even less than 20 are sourced from somewhere else, from China. They knit the glove, they dip the glove, they do all sorts of extra treatments on this glove, but that is not an NAFTA product. They need TPL to ship that finished glove to the United States. So it's still 80% US in terms of the yarn. All the cut, make, and trim, all the treatments, all the applications are done here, but that's not a NAFTA product without the TPL. So the TPL is a feature of NAFTA. It's not an exemption. It's not an add-on. It's not nothing. It is part of the deal. So the interesting part is that the Americans also have this. So despite the fact that the textile industry in the United States doesn't like this and complains and says this is an unreasonable thing, and I'll get to some of their quotes later, they use it too. So if you're in California, New York, you're a designer, you're bringing in fabrics from somewhere else, you want to sell that into Canada, you have a TPL to use. So you can sell yours, we can sell ours, the levels are not so different. Because again, why are we arguing about this? So again, the TPL is an important system, particularly for Canada. I'm going to skip right over there. So, as I mentioned before, I went to Washington last June, listened to the National Council of Textile Organizations, and they said, no, TPL is a bad thing. They're designed as a flexibility, but they're a blanket exception. Well, lots of people buy fabrics from the US, lots of people buy yarns. Why? Why? If it's like, you know, if we could all just go off, why wouldn't we? In reality, some people use imported fabric, some people don't. There you go. But no, according to them, it's this terrible loophole. We've got to get rid of it. They say TPL shifts benefits to China. Everything is China. Like China. Whatever. So what they do is they calculate all the losses in production, all the losses in jobs encountered in the United States because of this loophole, you know? 726 million here, all this kind of stuff. Okay, you know, whatever. The bottom line is, if the suit maker in Montreal couldn't get this fabric from China, or India, or Indonesia, or England for that matter, and if he couldn't use those imports, he wouldn't have a suit factory in Montreal. You would not be competitive, okay? And if you couldn't take that suit and send it to the US duty-free. So TPL actually keeps jobs here. It doesn't cause them to leave. And in fact, the problem is if you eliminated this benefit, if you eliminated the ability to use imported fabrics in Canadian production, and sending them to the States duty-free. If you eliminated that, well, actually we would send the jobs to China, because why would we bother making here if we can't sell them economically in the States? So I was at a presentation in Memphis, and there was a speech by the head of the National Council of Textile Organizations, and then they have a coffee break. And so in the course of his presentation, one of the things he called the use of TPL as a bank robbery. And so anyway, so here's Augie Tantillo says, you know, we're bank robbers and rapists and whatever. And then he went for a coffee break, and then I thought, okay, I'm coming on to this presentation after the coffee break. I'm gonna see what Augie says now. And Augie left. Couldn't believe it. He left. So I didn't get a chance to talk to him about why or why not I should be considered a bank robber. But that's exactly what the U.S. textile industry thinks about any flexibility, any ability to use imported inputs. It's a bad thing. I don't think any other organization that I'm aware of in the United States supports this. There's all sorts of groups, Julia's group, among them that have worked to try to get some common sense in terms of NAFTA. We had an industry letter with about 150 companies, about 110 of which were Canadian. Some of the companies here and many others that you'll know signed this to stop this foolishness. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details, but I want to demonstrate one point that I think is sort of emblematic of the U.S. approach. It's very much a Trump approach. It's about chapter notes, and no one knows what chapter notes are. They're in the customs tariff. There are different chapters identifying different products. Knit products, woven, are two different chapters. And there are chapter notes about how goods are classified. And in the chapter notes, this is a U.S. proposal under NAFTA, I'm just going to talk about sewing threads. They're basically arguing that we should not only require for a garment to be NAFTA to have yarn from NAFTA countries, that the yarn goes into the fabric is made in NAFTA, the garment is cut and sewn in NAFTA. They also want to require that the sewing thread has to be formed and finished within NAFTA to qualify. So think about this for a second. Can anyone tell me on a $10 garment, how much is the sewing thread worth? Someone can tell me? Yeah, yes, someone's like people trying to pull their fingers together, right? I don't know, was it 20 cents? I don't know. So that 20 cents worth of sewing thread could disqualify a garment that's otherwise made from 100% NAFTA. I can say that all the sewing thread made in Canada would not qualify under this. Okay. So all of the goods made in Canada that would otherwise qualify will no longer qualify. So this is the sort of length to which we're talking. So where are we? Okay, so just as a thumbnail sketch, I think the administration isn't entirely sold on eliminating TPLs. There's been a lot of negotiations. We sort of hit bottom in January, and then things started to go a little better till about June, when the G7 meeting hit and when the US president hit back, and all hell broke loose. So there have been no negotiations between the beginning of June and today that involve the Canadians. But again, before that period, I think we're getting to reasonable understandings about TPL. That is to say that US companies use it coming north and we use it going south, so we should be able to do this. The chapter note regarding sewing thread is not resolved, and actually that is a point of real concern. And of course, we have every other issue. And I do want to stress that when the NAFTA was signed, 20 odd years ago, textiles was a very important issue. It's not an important issue now. There's no question. It's irrelevant. It's silly. Why are we bothering? I said it, $1.3 billion surplus that they have with us. There's no reason for us to be doing this, but we are. But there's 10 other issues, way bigger. Now what's happening now is that the Mexicans and the United States are discussing, are talking. Every second day everyone says, oh, we're just about to sign something, or we're almost done. No one knows. And many of the provisions have to be negotiated trilaterally, so we don't know. I can talk more in depth about that if anyone wants to sort of know the blow by blow. But again, these things take time. I mean, most people in this room weren't working in the company they work at when NAFTA was signed. These agreements take a long time, 18 months at least, okay? We're just past a year. The negotiations started a year ago last week. So things take time. But we have an impatient president. We have all sorts of deadlines flowing around. It's kind of insanity. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead past NAFTA. Actually, I do want to come back. There's sort of 3 slides in a row. I said, this was not a good meeting, okay? This was also not a great meeting, but a little better meeting. So that's the Jean-Claude Juncker, head of the European Union. This was not a good meeting. This was really not a good meeting at the G7. Okay, so I don't know if we're getting along or not. But I do know that this was a really bad meeting. And I think there was so much blowback against the president that he wants friends. He wants to get some deals done. He doesn't just want to complain. He wants to complain about China, don't get me wrong, but I think the other things he would like to get done. So I do believe that we do have some momentum now. Not sure if it's going to take hold, but there's some chance over the next short period of time that we can have something. So, I'm going to skip past this, I'm going to skip past this, I'm going to talk about Europe. We have some Ukrainians over here. They're not part of the European Union, but we have free trade with them. We have some other countries like Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Iceland. They're not part of the European Union either, but we have free trade with them. And we have free trade as of last September with the European Union. So it is basically a slightly different agreement. The NAFTA is a fabric for a rule, so that fabric is made in any part of the territory. It can be the garments made from that fabric can be traded freely. Interestingly, though, it also has something like those TPLs that I talked about. They're called origin quotas, and they allow a certain amount of inputs to come from. So again, fabric for a rule of origin, and then origin quotas, otherwise known as these TPL. I'm not going to go into some of these details because it will run a little too late. Fairly straightforward. Let's duplicate. So, it's interesting. Things are going well. I think if you look at the European Free Trade Agreement, this is up to June, and most of our shipments hit in July, August. The increase is significant. You look at the Netherlands number, it's pretty much, I bet you, I'm not so sure, but it's probably the Canada Goose number. United Kingdom, much more diverse range of exporters. So again, things are going fine. Again, it's hard to ignore a 59% increase year to year. That's pretty good. I would also say that European exports to Canada are going up. I cannot tell you how many times I'm hearing the word Portugal these days, and certainly the numbers show it. Fortunately, there's no one here. There was a very nice vendor last year from Portugal at the show. But again, they're picking up market share, starting up from a much larger base than us, but we're both increasing in the same sort of direction. There is, of course, a problem with Brexit. Who knows what's going to happen? I would say that if you are one of those exporting companies that are doing very well in the UK, you should talk to me after just about whatever might happen next February when the UK leaves the EU. The Canadian government is looking at it, is looking at some different sort of scenarios so they don't cut people off in case there's no deal done, but it's very much uncertain. So again, it's interesting, our friends from Ukraine over here have the simplest rule of origin, cut and sew. Duty free, immediate, everything's duty free today. They don't have to worry about where the yarn's from, the fabric from, if it's imported or not, doesn't matter, it's all duty free. Same thing applies for these other countries that are not terribly relevant, but there you go. So, again, Ukraine, simpler than the EU. So the last sort of section I just wanted to roll through, not going to take too long, and that has to do with TPP. And again, from the outset I said, we have a different view on trade than the US. We've continued to do these things, sign free trade agreements, entertain new ones, and the American administration hasn't done that. So when TPP was negotiated, this is now former President Obama, and it's as if he has been erased from the policy landscape. First day in office, the Trump administration withdrew from TPP. So for a period of time, everyone was wondering, do we proceed with this thing? Do we not? I think at the end of the day, there were a few changes, a few tweaks, if you will, that were made for Canada. Some cultural issues and some IP provisions. But the bottom line is it's moving forward. It's now called the CPTPP, and I can never remember what the CP stands for, but it's basically no significant commercial change from what was negotiated previously. I do think it's kind of interesting that it is 6,000 pages. It's an insane thing. I don't think it actually exists in print. It's just all digital form because 6,000 pages. It's insanity. Interesting thing about the way it was done is that it included 11 or 12 countries at the time. And so what they would do is they would call them negotiating pairs. And so they would have two countries, usually one with an export interest and one with an import interest in the same product, negotiate that product. So for textiles and apparel, it was the US and Vietnam. And the US wanted essentially the NAFTA rule of origin, that old, awful, yarn-forward rule of origin. Vietnamese did not want that, but they got it. So we got stuck with this rule of origin that the US textile industry wanted, and no one else did. And so we joined the negotiations relatively late. Most of the outline of the rules of origin were already there. So it was very much a take it or leave it type of thing. And again, Canada wanted to be involved for many other reasons, agriculture, access to Asia, you name it. There are some other provisions in there, some flexibilities. They're called short supply provisions that allow you to use inputs, fabrics, yarns from other sources, provided that they're in quote-unquote short supply in the region. Very hard to identify, they're very complicated, they're very tightly described, and very few people are interested, so I'm not going to go into detail. So when we negotiated the TPP, just so you know, it wasn't going to replace NAFTA. For some other industries it does, actually. It basically superseded what was done in NAFTA, changed everything. We were actually signing TPP, and then we were going to have NAFTA. So that TPL that's under NAFTA, we kept it, well, but under TPP, there's no TPL. Okay? So, no problem. the idea was that we would have both and everything would be fine. So, again, I'm not going to go into too much details, except for this thing. Remember when I was talking about sewing thread in NAFTA? So what the Americans are asking for in terms of requiring NAFTA sewing thread, well, actually, we agreed to that in TPP. We agreed to it because we didn't care. We still had NAFTA, and NAFTA was going to continue, so we could say, okay, within TPP, we'll use this sewing thread rule. But it is unfortunate that we did agree to that under the TPP. Okay. So just for people that are wondering, obviously Vietnam's the big player in the TPP, and each country within TPP has its own tariff elimination schedule. The Americans had the most complicated thing in the world. You needed to have an abacus and a personal computer just to devise the schedules, to read the schedules. Crazy. But most of the countries did. So for Canada, it's very simple. There's two categories of apparel. You're either in that category or that, and there's a document you can read to figure out which is which. As an example, I also wanted to show Japan, almost everything's immediate. Australia, almost everything's immediate. So for the most part, fairly straightforward tariff phase out. But when does that start happening? That starts happening when 6 countries sign the TPP. So they've already signed it, but they have to ratify. Singapore, Japan, and Mexico have ratified so far. Presumably Canada will ratify it in the fall, and at some point, first half of next year, I would suspect that the duties will go down. So again, if you're seriously interested in Vietnam, several different things I want to stress. Make sure they're vertical. Make sure that the player that you're talking to can bring you Vietnamese yarn. Okay? You have to have yarn from the TPP region, and there are lots. There's a lot of vertically integrated companies in Vietnam. The Vietnamese Trade Commission met with about 60 companies a few weeks ago. So there's plenty of interest in what they're offering. They're good companies. But make sure that they have good handle on their yarn origin. So that's the first thing. And there's going to be a little bit of give or take. We're not sure what the schedule is going to be. I'm pretty confident that it will move forward. So then again, it takes 6 countries to ratify, then it's in force, and then the other countries can come on as they finish their ratification. I think it's going to go forward, and I think the tariffs will be impacted by next year. So just a second. So the other thing, of course, is that all the while that we're implementing TPP, the American government is kind of trying to get free trade agreements with some of the players. And I really, Julia knows this much better than I, but I don't understand this strategy. I don't see any country that wants to negotiate a bilateral agreement with the United States if it can avoid it. Americans have approached Japan, and they're trying to work something out. They've asked France, UK. Well, France can't negotiate a bilateral. They're part of the EU. UK, they can't negotiate until they're out of the EU. There's all sorts of things. So again, Americans have this strong desire to have bilaterals because they're bigger than everyone else. They don't want to be in any party or any group that diffuses their power. Not a very productive situation, and I love this I think it's the worst handshake in the history of mankind. So just a couple other things. LDC, as I said before, Bangladesh and Cambodia are LDC beneficiaries of these developed country tariffs. And again, last year around this time, the Canadian government made some changes for Haiti. If you're producing in Haiti, you could speak to me about those. They're very complicated, can't go into them now. I do want to stress one thing, and this is the audits for non-compliance. The LDC rule of origin looks very simple unless you read it. And if you read it, it says that your yarn has to be from certain countries or can't be from certain other countries. And of course the fabric has to be produced in certain countries. And the cut and sew has to be done in a least developed country. The only problem is, that's simple. So, oh, I know my yarn is from China, and it's woven in China, it's here. Do you have the documentation for that? I said, well, yeah, maybe some of that. I said, well, okay, we'd like to know for this garment order, we'd like to see your fabric purchasing, we'd like to see where that fabric was from. If it was from an agent, we need the mill, and if we need the mill, we also need the yarn mill. We need those people to provide information to verify your origin claim. Sorry? So the LDC program is making lots of auditors rich in Ottawa because the rules appear to be very simple, but they're not. And I can say for sure that one of the things that we would like to do is make them simpler. If we're going to give duty-free to Bangladesh, Cambodia, and any other country, don't make the importer pay just because some textile agent in Bangladesh doesn't do his paperwork well, which is what's happening now. So be cautious about that if you are sourcing from those countries. So again, in terms of other trade priorities, obviously closing NAFTA is number one. There's nothing else even close. I put Canada, Japan there. If TPP fails, we basically have a free trade agreement that's already been written with Japan. It's just sitting there. Again, TPP should be up there. Just trying to finish that off. Sorry for the edits. I also want to mention that we are currently negotiating with India. We're also negotiating with Mercosur, which includes Brazil. And to the great chagrin of my Indian friends, the Indian agreement is going nowhere, okay? It's not going anywhere at all. There's no movement, nothing. And the Prime Minister's recent trip to India did not greatly assist. So the real $64,000 question is China. Thought that by last Christmas, we thought we were going to move forward with China. That's not happened yet. The Canadian government is still interested. We're actually doing some focus groups about that topic with some of our members, just to understand what the issues are for companies. As I said, China is gradually reducing its market share. If we have free trade, which will be negotiated over 5 years, 8 years, if we negotiate a free trade agreement which eliminates those duties, is it really going to have that much of an impact when the FOB costs are so much lower than some other places? So it's an issue, but it's certainly on the horizon. So I believe we will hold off on questions until Julia's had her say, and then I will thank you for your interest, and if there are any questions I can answer them individually or together once we reconvene. Okay, thanks.